I'm a private school teacher.
I am a medical liaison.
I am a registrar's assistant at Midwestern University.
I'm a student at Ottawa
I am
University.
a business analyst.
Youth corrections officer.
Registered.
I'm a singer-songwriter.
I am
also
a
a student at
student worship pastor at Young Adult.
I am a electrician.
I am a
I'm a VMI operator.
business technology. My name is Nick.
Good morning. My name is Brad, and I am one of the pastors here at Copper Hills, and if I've not had a chance to meet you, I'd like that opportunity. So I will be out in the plaza area right after our gathering this morning, and if you'll stop by rather than run by, I would love to meet you. My wife left me last night for a week. Whew, right? She went to Minnesota you heard that, right? Minnesota, yeah? Yeah, she went to Minnesota, yeah. To look after 3 of our grandchildren whose parents are off to Hawaii. What a ridiculous trade-off that is, right? Yeah, somehow that doesn't quite make sense. So the reason I tell you that is that I'm taking gift cards to restaurants this week. That's why I'm telling you that. Okay, so in the arena, if you don't know where we've been with this series, we've been thinking through what life is like for those of us who would identify ourselves as followers of Jesus Christ, and how we live that life out in real terms, in real time, in a place where most of us are going to spend about a third of our lives, and maybe up to like 100,000 hours preparing for this. We go to school for it, we work at it for like 50 years, and then we recover from it. It's called retirement, but we're recovering from it. It's our place of work. It's the arena that we spend so much of our lives in, and we've been kind of thinking through, what does it really look like to be a follower of Jesus in that environment? And how do we live there with the pressures and tensions? Some of us live and work in environments where our jobs don't feel really meaningful. They don't feel purposeful. We work with difficult bosses or challenging colleagues, or it just doesn't line up with what we got our education in, or we face the early months of retirement and suddenly what are we getting up for today? Like, what's this about? Or we end up preparing for our careers and get 2 years into our major, and it just isn't what we want to do. And now what do I do? So you see, like it's challenging. It feels like an arena in some ways. So we've been thinking this idea through of what it's like to be a follower of Jesus in a place where we work through 2 questions. First of all, asking the first question is, does God really care about my work? Like, does it matter to him? And where we began with that is looking back at where work first appears in God's economy. And it happens really, really early on. He describes, through the writer of Genesis, that he worked at creating this world. It was wonderful work to him, and he created paradise. And even in paradise, where everything is just how he wants it, work is part of that. It's kind of central to what he does. And then he turns to us and he says, work with me now for the rest of your time here on earth. We'll do something together. We'll continue to create. We'll continue to do something wonderful for the world together. Now, we know it got wrecked along the way really early on, right? And so part of the work we do is redeeming what's gotten wrecked and spoiled and kind of ruined along the way. So if you ever find yourself in a place where I'm not sure my work is all that meaningful, it is to God, because he sees you as an agent of redemption wherever you are. There's no menial work when it comes to that. Redemption is the deal, right? Right? I mean, this is what Jesus comes into the world to do, to redeem what's been broken. And so if you feel like you're in a dead-end place, or college isn't taking you where you want, or you don't know what to do in retirement, man, it matters to God. It really does matter to him. It's a big deal to him. So that was the first question we looked at. Second question was this: does God matter to my work? And what role does he play? Am I there just earning a salary so that I can support my family and take care of myself and provide like the good life? Is that what it is? Is it like a life sentence to do what I do? Like how does God fit into that? And does he? So the bottom line here is what we did is we addressed the question in very simple terms this way, that if our lives have genuinely been impacted with what Jesus Christ promised to do for us and exhibited the power of that through his death and resurrection, which was to come to humanity and say, I want to redeem you and restore you into a warm, intimate friendship with your Father. And if that is real for us, not just a theory, not just a religious idea, not just a doctrine, but we've actually seen a transfer, a transition, a change to be thinking differently as a result of that decision. Because you don't just fall into that decision. It doesn't just happen. You're not just born into it. It's actually a choice you make along the way to move from autonomy to dependence on his grace and his mercy and his goodness. And what he describes then is that you become a new person, not just a tweak of the old, not just a new set of behaviors to follow, not a new faith to believe in. You become an entirely new person. And if you've experienced that in your soul and your life, the idea would be that it actually shifts our worldview. We see things a little differently. We process the experiences of life along the way differently. It actually overtakes how we see the world, and that affects, of all places, because we spend so much time there, our workplace, how we do it. We looked at this verse. This is what Paul, who has this amazing transformation experience, writes to some friends in Colossae, a town where he started a church. In Colossians 3, he says this. This is a repeat from last week. Let the message about Christ in all of its richness fill your lives. Not just tinker with you a little bit, just fill you up. And as a result, teach and counsel each other with all the wisdom that he gives. Sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God with thankful hearts. And whatever you do or say, that's about everything, right? Do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. In other words, whatever this message about Christ is so pervasive, so profound, so transformative, that it turns out that you and I, when we've experienced it and live it, we actually become representatives of the Lord Jesus wherever we are. And we spend so much time in our work that is one of the places. I want to depict it this way. And I was triggered last night as I saw a couple roll up with a stroller and a 2-week-old little baby boy in the stroller. And I was taken back to a time about 3 months ago where we met together in the coffee shop. And they talked about their inability to have children and how they longed to adopt a child. And they had tried a number of times. And can you imagine the heartbreak? Some of you can, because you've been there. You get right to the edge where it's going to happen. You get the phone call. And then the option is taken away. Well, this time they got a phone call to come to Florida and meet birth mom. And they got to Florida. And they flew back with their baby boy. Now that little boy, don't know the story of mom, right? But that little boy is going to grow up in a home where he's chosen by his parents. They didn't have him naturally, biologically. And he's going to get to tell the story that I may not have been wanted by my birth mom for whatever the circumstances were. But I was wanted by my mom and my dad, and they raised me in a loving home in a wonderful place. And I am wanted and I'm loved, and that's my story. Now, he may not catch on to that early on, but maybe late adolescence, early teens, whatever it would be. What happens to him when that finally just settles in his soul and he is so wanted and loved by his mom and dad? That's the lens through which he'll see all of life, right? So it is for us who have said yes to Jesus. We're told we've been adopted into the family of God. We're his sons and daughters. And that's our story. That's the message of Jesus. Jesus came along and said, I'll do whatever it takes, whatever it costs me for that to happen. And then it cost him everything to do that. So once you've been impacted with that and you see the fruit of that, what Paul is teaching here is it's going to change how you see your work. You're going to do it and be who you are in that place through that lens. So I say all that to bring you up to speed because I want to carry on with the very same passage that we just read, the next verses. And what Paul does in the next verses of this text is he begins to lay out a real practical set of principles and ideas and things that you and I can do in our workplace as followers of Jesus Christ. And so he moves from this big picture to kind of fine line a little bit to give some practical ideas. So let me read the next 4 or 5 verses in that section. I'm just going to read it through and then go back and make a couple of comments along the way. So this is Colossians 2:22 to 4:1. This is what he says. Slaves. Now hold on, just as it says slaves, right? Some of you check out at that point maybe because, well, that's not relevant for my world. I'll give you a little background in just a second. So let's read. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Try to please them all the time, not just when they're watching you. Serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Work diligently or willingly at whatever you do, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and that the master you're serving is Christ. But if you do what is wrong, you'll be paid back for the wrong you've done, for God has no favorites. Masters, be just and fair to your slaves. Remember that you also have a master in heaven. Okay, so this master-slave language that Paul uses here, it's a little foreign to us. And it's important to understand the context of what Paul's writing here, because it is, in some ways, and maybe not politically correct in our culture to speak about it in these kinds of what can appear to be almost cavalier terms. And that leaves us either missing out how this can be relevant to our lives. For some, it's actually offensive, and I've had enough conversations with people who would actually say, see, the Bible condones slavery. This is what is going on here. Well, 2 things to keep in mind. One is the audience to who Paul's writing, and the second is, what is the cultural reality of slavery? How is it viewed in the culture that he writes it in? So first of all, the audience. So Paul's addressing a group of Christians, a group of Jesus followers, probably gathering together on a Sunday morning as a household unit. Now, we know that in the early days of the Christian church, we know that people met in homes and they met in temple courts or in public spaces wherever they could find. But you have to understand that Christianity was not easily, quickly embraced, and so it was hard to find public space to gather in, to meet in. They were seen with skepticism and fear. There was opposition to them, and so you can just see there was resistance to them meeting. So many times, Sunday morning was gatherings of households. Well, who's a household? Well, a household would be grandparents and parents and children and cousins and uncles. Recently, when we were in Israel, our tour guide lived with his whole household. There was 110 people in their compound that lived together. So that's how they typically would meet. And when these households would meet, there was a certain household code that they operated under that kept things orderly and kept things, you knew who was telling the shots and directing things, and it was not just unique to Christians. The early Jewish scriptures did this, as well as contemporary Roman culture. So here they are, they're getting together as a group, and they're not talking about slavery in the sense of dealing with it as a social issue or public policy or that kind of thing. You know what they're talking about slavery for? Because there are slaves in their group, and there are masters in their group, and they're trying to figure out, what does it mean to be this follower of Jesus in that kind of an environment? They're trying to give a little bit of direction. Paul's trying to help them out with what it looks like to really, on the ground, live for Jesus in that kind of environment. So they're not condoning or nor condemning slavery or their culture in any broad terms. Rather, they're just trying to think through with the Holy Spirit, this is our reality. What do we do in this sense? It's really a great question that we could afford to think through as well. Even in our own history, with the scourge of slavery that we've experienced, which is a different kind of slavery, it would be the Quakers and the evangelical church that would push back strongly in the public forum against slavery. And it kind of came out of a spiritual renewal in the 1800s within our own country, known as the Great Awakening. It created a spiritual environment that created a very public, very political movement against slavery. So here's the question. So if that is what Jesus followers did in the 1800s, why didn't they do that in the first century? Well, here's the second question, because slavery was seen differently. It was a different kind of social identity than it was for us in the 1800s. Slavery in the first century was not race-related. It was not permanent, and slaves actually had rights. You actually could, in some cases, you could go to court and possibly find an advocate that would defend you as a slave if you had been mistreated. You could own property as a slave. You could have businesses. You could even own your own slaves. So a totally different environment. Typically, you became a slave in one of two ways. Your country or city lost a war, and you became the working class of the country that won the war. It was the result of having lost. I recently talked to a man who came from a Middle Eastern country and came here to the U.S. and was working as a landscaper. I struck up a conversation with him and said, so what was your profession, the country you came from? He said, I was a surgeon. I go, what? He said, yeah, I have no professional credentials here. I can't practice that. I have to provide for my family. And so I'm landscaping. And that's the kind of thing that it was in the first century. But here, by far, the most common way that you became a slave is if you got into some financial trouble, you took on debt that you couldn't take care of, you couldn't pay back. And unfortunately, Dave Ramsey wasn't around with Financial Peace University, right? Could have taken that 9-week class and, avoided the slavery thing. So in order to pay back the debt, you would agree to become a servant, a slave of the person you owed money to. And once you had worked that off, you would be set free. So Paul's simply trying to give a really practical set of principles or advice for people who find themselves in those kinds of settings. One historian described the life of a first century slave, or domestic servant is probably a better way to say it, or indentured servant if you want, as frustrating, overwhelming, and demanding. And when I read that, I said, sounds like us. Sounds like so many of us in our work. It's frustrating, it's overwhelming, and demanding. One thing as well that I want to add here is the way the followers of Jesus, both slaves and masters, lived together in those frustrating, overwhelming, and demanding work environments was so attractive, get this, so attractive that the early church was flooded with slaves as part of those gatherings. It was so attractive that slaves found themselves drawn to that kind of environment where the message-believing, Jesus-following masters and people would offer meaningful, satisfying joy for them. And the result was, often Christian households had an inordinately higher ratio of slaves in their homes than non-Jesus loving homes, because they saw it as an opportunity of supporting the destitute and the poor. Often a slave of Jesus followers would be freed from their debt and imposed obligation way before the debt had actually been paid. In fact, I read one story so cool. One wealthy master, over the course of his life, he was a business guy, bought and then immediately freed over 100 slaves in the course of his lifetime, just to give them their freedom. And the other thing, slaves often would stay with their master long after their account had been paid for, because it was a place of safety and acceptance and freedom. Okay, what's going on here? And why do I raise all that history? Because somehow these people found out, as Jesus followers, what it meant to be a Jesus follower in real terms, in an environment where slavery and these kinds of things were going on. They found a way, thoughtfully, carefully, guided by the Spirit, to be an influence in their workplace, if you will, in extremely frustrating, overwhelming, and disappointing experiences. And we're invited to do that very same thing. And now Paul's going to help us in this passage with some suggestions. He's going to give us 5 ideas of what we can do to actually realistically, practically implement what's in our heart to do. But here's the interesting thing that he does. Before he gives them, we're actually woven into them, into those 5. 4 times he comes back to the same bottom line why we would do that. So he gives what the practical steps are, but 4 times he repeats, here's why you would do that. Here's the why. And our whys always drive us, right? They do. Our why is what drives our what. So this is what he says. I'll put the verses back up, and I just want to highlight the 4 times that he reminds his readers and us why those 5 practical steps are going to be presented. So back to verse 22, he says, serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear for the Lord. That's a why. Verse 23, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Verse 24, the master you are serving is Christ. And in verse 1 of chapter 4, you also have a master in heaven. In other words, we always do our work for someone. There's a why behind what we do. We do it for someone, but who are we going to do it for? It's really, really important. There are some options that we have. And actually, they're all good options. One option in terms of who we're going to work for is ourselves. And that's not all bad. You know, discover what you're gifted at, what your skills are, what your training is in, and you do that. Or you work for yourself for the money to have some security and to reduce debt and to plan for the future. You work for yourself for some kind of self-fulfillment and sense of personal meaning and destiny. That's good, isn't it? It's good. You might choose to work for our families, you know, to be a good provider and protector for our families. And my goodness, that's a good yes. Our supervisors, possibly, bosses or owners, like this references, even colleagues, to be a great team player and to work for one another and do that together as a team, that's really good. So what's the issue here? Well, here's the thing. All three of those are either internal or external, constant pressures that those would not just be good things or people to work for, but they would be the ultimate thing or person to work for. That comes from a demanding boss who expects more than we can ever give, or an internal demand maybe driven by insecurity or pride or whatever it is to achieve and then overachieve at great cost to our family and ourselves. Or it can be this innate call to be like perfect or to be proving ourselves in some way. And the danger is that those good motivators for who we work for become the ultimate person that we work for. And when we get that wrong, the internal and interior good that isn't Jesus ultimately brings us into a place where we get in trouble, where the ultimate good becomes something other than Jesus. And what Paul's reminding 4 times, no, you work for Jesus because that is the ultimate good. What Paul appears to be asking is a question that's worth us asking. Who do you work for? So tomorrow morning, when you head out on your commute to wherever you work, who are you commuting for? Who are you going to work for? Who is the ultimate good for you? 2 weeks ago, I told you a story about working in a retail business, and my particular operation was open 363 days of the year, and I was there parts of 363 days of the year. And I told you I kind of lost my identity of whose I was and who I was. I would send my family off to church on Sunday morning, and I would head off to work, and it all seemed right to me. Made sense to me. It made sense to go and work and be part of every single day, to be part of the management of every little thing, and it just all seemed right to me. Partly personality, but I also lost my identity. But here's what I didn't tell you. A couple of months after I realized what was going on, Elfie and I were in bed late at night, and it was our practice to open up the Bible and read a passage. And a passage that we read led us to a conversation that said, I'm just not really, I don't know that I am where I should be, because I think I'm working for myself, and I'm not finding real fulfillment in that, because this is wearying me and tiring me. I work for the company I work for, but every time we hit a sales goal or a profit goal, there isn't much cheering. The goal just goes up. And year after year, the goal just goes up. And I can't get there anymore, and I don't have the energy that I had, and it just doesn't, it's not motivating me like it had in the past. And so that night, we opened up the Bible. I don't think it was by chance, but we opened up to 1 John 5, where John, he's late in his life. He's this close friend of Jesus, and I think he writes from his own personal experience. He says, I've discovered that when I ask Jesus for something, and it's in alignment with what he would want for me, I can just ask him and consider it done. I can just live that way. So we prayed together that night that God would help find some new purpose in my life. Essentially what we were asking, not in these terms, but I needed a new employer. I needed to work for someone else rather than myself or just for my family, providing for a young family or for my company. So the next morning, got up, and by noon that day, someone had slid an envelope across my desk and said, "We don't need you anymore." Now, I'm not recommending this, okay? But I think it matters to Jesus who we work for. I took a month after that just to every morning sit by a riverside with a lawn chair and a Bible and a journal. And I reconnected with Jesus in a wonderful and profound way. And I discovered that it's him I want to work for because he's a good boss. He's good and merciful and kind and gracious, and this is just who he is. So I want to ask you again, who do you work for? And how's your boss? It's a really great question to think about. Many years ago, someone asked me this question, and it's kind of an in-your-face question that my initial reaction to it was kind of a negative, visceral reaction. But he caused me to think a little bit. This is the question he asked. He says, if you wake up tomorrow morning, which of these scenarios would create the greatest fear or angst or even panic in you? Scenario 1. You discover that all your money is gone, your professional credentials are void, your company has folded, and you have no way of making an income. So scary, right? Second scenario. You wake up to discover that there really isn't a God and it's all a myth. Which one would cause you the greatest angst? Behind that, I know it's brash and may not be appreciated, but behind it is a great question. Who do you and I work for? Paul goes on from here, and now after laying that question out, he says, here are 5 practical things that you can figure out how to apply. It's interesting to me. Paul does not go on a long description of these things. He doesn't apply them personally. He just presents them to people almost as if he writes them and goes, I think you'll figure it out. I think you'll have conversations in your household group. I think when you get this letter, you'll sit down and it'll matter so much to you. Once you decide that Jesus is who you're going to work for, here are 5 things. Why don't you get together as a household unit or in small groups or whatever you're going to do and think through these 5 and you personally make application. You help one another figure these out. So I'm just going to do what Paul did. I'm going to read those out from these verses and then I think just leave it with you. That you can talk to people and think together, how do I personally apply these? So back to verse 22 again. Here's the first thing he says. He says, obey your earthly masters in everything you do, which of course means leave your integrity on the shelf. And if they ask you to work 80 hours a week, just work 80 hours a week. That's what obeying them is, right? Only if they're still your boss. But if Jesus is your boss, you get to think through what are the boundaries that are good for my soul? And how am I going to communicate that? And how am I going to figure this out? And you might just need the support of someone to think that through with you because you can be so close to it, not be able to see past it. So we need to do this as a community, involve one another to figure out how is it that I would apply that idea of obeying my earthly master in everything that I do. We're going to pick that up a little bit more next week when we think about like working in kind of an unhurried environment. Verse 22 says a second one in it. It says, try to please them all the time, not just when they're watching you. So that's like integrity. There's this old definition of integrity. Integrity is who you are when no one's looking. How do you apply that in your place of work? Verse 23 has the third one. Work willingly at whatever you do. And I kind of think what Paul is saying here is he says, like, if you really love what you're doing, you already do it willingly, right? But if you don't like what you're doing and it's overwhelming and it's disappointing and it's frustrating, work willingly at whatever you aren't willing to do. That's about an internal mindset and an attitude. Quick story. 25 5 years or so ago, I was early on in my role as a pastor at the church that invited me to leave my business career and become a pastor. And for the first 2 years that I was there, I worked next to my buddy, who we just were in sync, like visionary and wanted to do great things for Jesus and active, a ton of things happening. And then he needed to leave to go back to his hometown to care for his aging parents. So for the next year or so, it was just the rest of us staff just doing it together, and it was a wonderful community of leaders doing it. But we were looking for a new lead pastor. And this is what churches do occasionally. You might have experienced it yourself. You look at the lead pastor that was there, and as strong as that person is, they all have some weaknesses and things they're not so good at. So what churches often do is they hire to those weaknesses over here, thinking we're going to get all the strengths, plus we're going to get those weaknesses. Well, it just doesn't happen that way. So they go way to this side, and that's what happened in this case. My friend that had hired me to be a pastor was this entrepreneurial, visionary, forward-thinking guy, and I accelerated in that kind of an environment. The pastor they hired after him was not like that. Not being unkind. He didn't have a visionary bone in his body. But he was an unbelievably good pastor of people. And I didn't like working with him. Because I had things to do, things I wanted to accomplish. We were doing great things for Jesus in our community. And there just was no buy-in. It was like dragging him along to get to do it. It was just really hard 3 years. We were really good to one another. We were kind and generous, and it wasn't like conflict. It was just hard. You ever worked with that in that environment? It's just hard. Well, a year and a half or so ago, I had the opportunity to go back for kind of a church gathering celebrating 50 years for that church's life. And the pastor that was really hard to work with was there. And I had the joy of going up to him and holding him by his shoulders and saying, "I'm so grateful for you. You taught me how to be a pastor. I was watching you, and as much as this wasn't easy for either one of us, I'm so grateful for what you taught me about being a pastor." I wasn't all that willing, but kind of persevered through it. And now I'm a better person because of you. It was just a wonderful moment together. It really, really was. I think what Paul is saying is we all face times where we're not willing. Can we still be willing and not give up quickly or easily? The next two are kind of as a result of being willing. Remember, the Lord will give you an inheritance as a reward. I can't tell you the reward it was to work for this alongside this guy. And I can't imagine the second thing, which he says will pay back for the wrong. I can't imagine if I'd undermined him or worked against him or just thrown, I can't imagine the results of that. But I think Paul is here really trying so carefully and wonderfully to encourage us in these practical kinds of ways. But we have to think through, how do we apply? And then he finishes off with a real practical suggestion to masters or bosses, if you will. Be just and fair to your slaves. Remember, you also have a master. Never forget that if you are overseeing people, that you are overseen by Jesus. And if he is your boss, do you know what he is thinking? Your employees are going to mistake you for him over time. They're going to think wonderfully of Jesus. They're going to think, my goodness, Jesus must be forgiving, must be incredibly patient, must give second and third and fourth chances. My goodness, when Jesus tells the truth, he tells it straight up, but he does it with a kindness. He's direct but loving. That's the intent. But again, it goes back to this verse that Paul gives us early on. It's whether or not the message of Jesus has so captivated our imagination and our thinking that we naturally and easily now are an accurate representation of him. What a mandate we have to impact our places of work, our schools, and even in retirement, those associations and networks that we're part of. Okay, so what would we do with this? I said it earlier. I think some of this we have to figure out together in community. So if you've got those 5 practical things nailed and you know exactly how to apply them, go do it. Fantastic. If you don't, would you make it a priority this week to teleconference with someone, meet over a coffee, have lunch, and actually take that passage of Scripture together and go, okay, here's my situation. How is it that I could do something I'm not willing to do, but do it willingly? How is it that I could be aware of how I do things even when my boss isn't working? I do most of my job remotely. This is what we do in community. And I think through it, we really become a model of who Jesus is. Cool? All right, so Jesus, I think we would look to you for your help in this. That you would give us your ideas, how to apply this. You, by your Spirit, gave words to Paul to write. And now we've reflected on those. But the truth is, we need a little bit of your help and insight to figure out how to apply these ourselves. Thank you, Spirit, that you do that. May we be courageous enough and humble enough to invoke the help of friends and colleagues and family and think through this together. Who really are we working for? And practically, how do we apply that in the unique work, school, retired environment that we're in? And we'll be grateful for your help with it, Jesus. Amen.